The morning Henry Richardson woke up to make his son breakfast, he had no idea it would be the last normal day of his life. The kitchen still smelled like the vanilla candles his wife Candace loved, and 6-year-old Ethan sat at the table, swinging his legs and humming a tune from some cartoon. Henry placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him and ruffled his dark hair. "Big day today, champ," Henry said. "Dr. Morrison is going to check out that arm." Ethan had fallen off his bike 2 weeks ago, and while the x-rays showed no break, the pediatrician wanted to follow up with the orthopedic specialist. Henry had taken time off from his documentary production company to drive him, but Candace had other plans. "Actually, Mom's going to take him," Candace said, entering the kitchen in her yoga outfit. She barely looked at Henry as she poured herself coffee. "You have that meeting with the investors, remember? For the new project." Henry's jaw tightened. He'd rescheduled that meeting twice already, and Candace knew it. "I can move it again. I want to be there." "Henry, stop being so overprotective. Mom's perfectly capable of taking Ethan to the doctor. Besides, she offered, and you know how she gets when we turn her down." That was true enough. Gertrude Sims had a way of making her displeasure known, usually through weeks of passive-aggressive comments and accidental exclusions from family events. Since Candace's father died 5 years ago, Gertrude had become increasingly involved in their lives, to the point where Henry sometimes felt like he was married to both women. "I don't like it," Henry said quietly, watching Ethan scrape up the last of his eggs. "You don't like anything involving my mother," Candace shot back. "It's one appointment, Henry. Let it go." Henry had learned to pick his battles. Their marriage had been strained for the past year, ever since his documentary exposing a pharmaceutical company's illegal drug trials had cost him several major contracts. Money was tight, tensions were high, and Candace had started spending more time at her mother's sprawling estate in the suburbs than at their modest home in the city. Gertrude arrived at 10 sharp, her silver Mercedes pulling into the driveway with the precision of a military operation. She was a tall, angular woman in her late 60s, always impeccably dressed, always wearing the same perfume that reminded Henry of funeral homes. Old money ran in the Sims family. Candace's grandfather had made a fortune in real estate development, and Gertrude guarded that legacy like a dragon guards gold. "Ready, sweetheart?" Gertrude asked Ethan, completely ignoring Henry, standing in the doorway. "The appointment's at 2, Henry said. "I'll have my phone on me if—" "We'll be fine," Gertrude interrupted, her voice sharp as glass. "Come along, Ethan." Henry watched them drive away, that familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. Something about Gertrude had always unsettled him, though he'd never been able to put his finger on exactly what. Maybe it was the way she looked at Ethan sometimes, like he was a possession rather than a person, or the way she and Candace would stop talking when he entered a room. He tried to focus on work, reviewing footage for his latest project, a documentary about corruption in foster care systems. But his mind kept drifting. At 1:30, he texted Candace, "Everything okay?" No response. At 2:15, he called the orthopedic office. "Hi, this is Henry Richardson. My son Ethan had a 2 o'clock appointment with Dr. Morrison. Can you confirm he checked in?" The receptionist put him on hold. When she came back, her voice had changed. "Sir, I don't see any check-in for Ethan Richardson. Are you sure the appointment was today?" Henry's blood ran cold. Yes, his grandmother was bringing him. Gertrude Sims. "Let me check our system." "No, sir. No one by that name has checked in either. Would you like to reschedule?" He hung up without answering and immediately called Gertrude. Straight to voicemail. He called Candace. Same thing. He called Gertrude's house. Nothing. By 4 o'clock, Henry was pacing their living room, calling every number he had. Gertrude's country club, her bridge partner, her attorney. No one had seen her. He called the hospital where the appointment was scheduled. "Mr. Richardson, I spoke with you earlier," the receptionist said, recognition in her voice. "Your son never arrived. Have you considered filing a missing persons report?" "They've been gone 6 hours, Henry said, forcing himself to stay calm. "She probably just took him somewhere." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. He called Candace again, and again. By 6 o'clock, he called her 63 times. Every call went to voicemail. When Candace finally walked through the door at 7:30, She had shopping bags in her hands and not a care in the world. Where the hell is Ethan? Henry demanded. She looked at him like he was insane. With Mom, obviously. Why are you freaking out? He never made it to his appointment. I've been calling you for hours. My phone died. She set down her bags. And I'm sure Mom just took him for ice cream or something. You know how she spoils him. Candace, the hospital called me at 4. He never arrived. I've called your mother 63 times. 63. She's not answering. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Candace's face. Not worry, but annoyance. Henry, you're being paranoid. Mom probably wanted to spend time with him. She'll bring him back when she's ready. When she's ready? Henry felt like he was losing his mind. Our 6-year-old son has been missing for 9 hours, and you're acting like this is normal. He's not missing. He's with my mother. Candace's voice turned icy. I'm going to take a bath. When they get back, try not to make a scene, okay? Mom doesn't appreciate your dramatics. She left him standing in the living room, his hands shaking with rage and fear. Something was wrong. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. But what could he do? Call the police and report that his mother-in-law took his son and wasn't answering her phone? They'd laugh at him. He stayed up all night, sitting in the dark living room, his phone in his hand. Candace went to bed around 10, completely unconcerned. Around midnight, Henry called the police anyway. They took a report, but made it clear they couldn't do much. There was no evidence of foul play, and family members took children places all the time. If he's not back by morning, call us again, the officer said. At 3:47 a.m., Henry heard the back door creak open. He was on his feet instantly, his heart hammering. The house was silent except for the soft shuffle of small feet on the kitchen tile. Henry turned on the light. Ethan stood in the doorway, and Henry's world tilted on its axis. His son's hair, his beautiful dark hair that Candace loved to brush, was completely shaved off. His scalp was pale and vulnerable in the harsh kitchen light, and there was blood. Dried blood caked around his left ear and down his neck. He was wearing clothes Henry had never seen before, a plain gray sweatshirt and black pants, both too big for his small frame. But what made Henry's blood turn to ice was his son's eyes. They were empty, hollow, like someone had reached inside and scooped out everything that made Ethan Ethan. Buddy, Henry whispered, dropping to his knees. Oh God, what happened? Where's Grandma? Ethan looked at him with those dead eyes. Grandma made me promise not to tell you where we went. His voice was flat, robotic, like he'd been coached. Henry pulled his son into his arms, feeling how stiff and unresponsive he was. It's okay. You can tell Daddy. You can tell me anything. I promised, Ethan repeated. She said you try to take me away if I told. She said I have to be a good boy. Henry's hands were shaking as he examined his son. No obvious injuries except for whatever had caused the blood near his ear. Then he checked Ethan's arm, the one that had been hurt. He pushed up the sleeve. There on the inside of his forearm was a small tattoo. Fresh, still red and inflamed. A number, 2847. Henry stopped breathing. He'd seen marks like this before. In his research for his foster care documentary, he'd interviewed children who'd been trafficked. They were marked, tagged like inventory. Ethan, did Grandma take you to a building? Were there other people there? Ethan's lip trembled. I promised. Forget the promise. Daddy needs to know. But Ethan just shook his head, tears finally spilling down his cheeks, and Henry realized he wasn't going to get answers. Not tonight. Maybe not ever, depending on what psychological damage had been done. He heard Candace's footsteps on the stairs. Henry? Is that? Oh good, they're back. See? I told you everything was fine. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, saw Ethan's shaved head and the blood, and her face went completely blank. Not shocked, not horrified, just blank. Candace, Henry said slowly, standing up with Ethan in his arms. What did your mother do to our son? I don't know what you're talking about. His head is shaved. He's covered in blood. He has a fucking tattoo on his arm. What did she do? Candace's eyes flickered to the tattoo, and Henry saw it. Recognition. She knew. She'd known all along. I need to call Mom, Candace said, reaching for her phone. Don't you dare. Henry's voice was lethal. Don't you fucking dare warn her. Henry, you're being irrational. I'm taking him to the hospital. Right now. No. Candace's mask slipped, and for the first time, Henry saw panic. "You can't." Mom said. "Mom said what, Candace? What exactly did your mother tell you?" But Candace was already backing away, phone in her hand. Henry didn't wait. He carried Ethan upstairs, grabbed their go bag, something he kept packed for emergencies ever since his investigative work had made him paranoid, and threw in extra clothes for both of them. Ethan was silent the entire time, that dead look still in his eyes. "We're going on an adventure," Henry told him softly. "Just you and me. Is that okay?" Ethan nodded, but didn't speak. Henry could hear Candace on the phone downstairs, her voice urgent and hushed. He had maybe 5 minutes before Gertrude, or whoever she was working with, knew he was running. He looked at his son, at that terrible number on his arm, and made a decision. They were gone in 10 minutes. Henry drove through the night, heading north with no specific destination in mind. Ethan fell asleep in the back seat, clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur that Henry had grabbed on the way out. Every few minutes, Henry glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights following them. His mind was racing. That tattoo, the shaved head, the blood, the dead look in his son's eyes, and Candace's reaction, not surprise, but fear that he'd found out. How long had this been going on? What had Gertrude done to his son? And more importantly, why? He needed to think. He needed a plan. But first, he needed to get Ethan somewhere safe, get him checked by a doctor he could trust, and figure out what the hell he'd stumbled into. At dawn, Henry pulled into a small town in upstate New York, found a motel that looked like it hadn't updated since 1985, and paid cash for a room. The clerk barely looked up from his magazine. Inside the cramped room, Henry laid Ethan on the bed and finally examined him properly. The blood was from a cut behind his ear, precise, surgical, like someone had cut away a small piece of skin. Henry cleaned it carefully, his hands shaking. The tattoo was professional, not crude. Someone who knew what they were doing had put that number on his son's arm. His phone had been vibrating constantly. Candace. Gertrude. Candace. Unknown numbers. He turned it off and pulled out the burner phone he kept in his go bag, a habit from his more dangerous documentary work. There was only one person he could call who would believe him and help without questions. Randy Sanders had been his best friend since college, now a lawyer specializing in family law with connections throughout the state. More importantly, Randy had helped him navigate dangerous situations before when his investigative work had made him enemies. "Henry." Randy's voice was thick with sleep. "It's 6 in the morning. This better be. I need your help. I can't explain over the phone. Can you meet me?" Something in Henry's voice must have gotten through. "Where are you?" "Pine Creek. The Evergreen Motel on Route 9. I'll be there in 3 hours." Henry sat in a chair by the window, watching his son sleep, and tried to piece together what he knew. Gertrude Sims came from old money. The kind of old money that had secrets. The kind that had power. But what would possess her to do this to her own grandson? Unless Ethan wasn't her grandson at all. Not really. What if he was something else? Property? Inventory? The thought made Henry sick, but he'd learned in his years of investigative work that wealthy people were capable of monstrous things when they thought themselves above consequences. He pulled out his laptop and started searching. Gertrude Sims. Her father, Clayton Sims. The Sims real estate empire. But there was something else, a detail he'd heard at a family dinner once and dismissed. The Sims family was connected to several private charities. Children's charities. Henry's blood ran cold. He dug deeper, using techniques he'd learned from his documentaries. Accessing public records, cross-referencing board members, following money trails. And there it was, the Sims Foundation for Children's Welfare. Gertrude was the director. They ran programs for at-risk youth, organized international adoptions, funded children's homes across 3 states. On paper, it was philanthropic, noble even, but Henry had learned to read between the lines. He found articles about children who'd gone missing from Sims Foundation programs. Not many, just enough to raise questions if anyone was paying attention. But each case had been quietly closed. No investigations, no follow-up. Just children vanishing into thin air. When Randy arrived, Henry was halfway through a bottle of cheap motel coffee and deep into the darkest rabbit hole of his career. "Jesus Christ," Randy said, looking at Ethan's shaved head. What happened? Henry told him everything. The missed appointment, the 3 a.m. return, the tattoo, Candace's reaction. Randy's face went from shock to grim. Let me see the arm. He examined the tattoo, took photos, measured it. This is professional work. Medical grade ink. And this number format. I've seen it before in trafficking cases. Henry, I think your mother-in-law is involved in something big. How big? The kind of big where people disappear for asking questions. Randy sat down heavily. The kind of big where even calling the police might get you killed. So what do I do? Randy was quiet for a long moment. You document everything, every detail, every connection, and you build a case so airtight that when it goes public, they can't bury it. They can't make it disappear. That could take months. Then you better get started. Randy looked at Ethan, and you need to keep him safe, far away from Gertrude and Candace. Because if they're part of this, and it sounds like they are, they'll come for him. Why? Henry's voice broke. Why would Candace let her own mother do this to our son? Money, control, indoctrination. Take your pick. Randy's voice was bitter. I've seen it before. Wealthy families with dark secrets raise their children to accept those secrets as normal. Candace probably grew up around this. It's all she knows. The thought made Henry want to vomit. The woman he'd married, the mother of his child, had been complicit in something unspeakable. There's something else, Randy said carefully. That tattoo. Those numbers are used to track inventory in trafficking networks. If your son has one, there are probably other children. Maybe dozens. Maybe more. Henry looked at his sleeping son and felt something harden inside him. This wasn't just about saving Ethan anymore. This was about burning down whatever sick operation Gertrude Sims was running and making sure every child marked like his son was freed. I'm going to need equipment, Henry said. Cameras. Microphones. Everything. Randy nodded. I know people. But Henry, whatever you're planning, be careful. These people have money and power. They're not going to go down easy. I don't care if they go down easy, Henry said quietly. I just care that they go down. Over the next 2 weeks, Henry set up a new life. Randy helped him rent a house under a false name in a small town 3 hours from the city. It wasn't fancy, a 2-bedroom ranch with a fenced yard and neighbors who minded their own business. But it was safe, and that was all that mattered. Ethan slowly began to come back to himself. The dead look in his eyes faded, replaced by a wariness that broke Henry's heart. He didn't talk about what happened with Gertrude, but he had nightmares. Bad ones. He'd wake up screaming about the room and the other children and the man with the camera. Henry took him to a child psychologist Randy recommended, someone who specialized in trauma and knew how to keep secrets. Dr. Karen Davenport was a small woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an iron will. After 3 sessions with Ethan, she pulled Henry aside. Your son has been subjected to significant psychological manipulation, she said bluntly. Someone trained him not to talk, threatened him, showed him things meant to terrify him into silence. Can you help him? Yes, but it will take time. And Henry, whoever did this to him, is very, very good at what they do. This isn't amateur hour. This is organized, professional. Henry already knew that. But hearing it from a professional made it real in a way it hadn't been before. While Ethan worked with Dr. Davenport, Henry worked on his investigation. He'd built his career on exposing uncomfortable truths, but this was different. This was personal. This was his son. He started with public records. The Sims Foundation had properties in 4 states: New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Children's homes, orphanages, foster care facilities, all clean on paper, all regularly inspected and approved. But when Henry started cross-referencing the children who'd passed through these facilities with missing persons reports, patterns emerged. Children who arrived at Sims facilities often disappeared from the system within months. The documentation said they'd been adopted, usually international adoptions, but when Henry tried to track down the adoptive families, he hit walls. Fake addresses, disconnected phones, shell companies. The children were vanishing. Henry set up a war room in his basement. Maps on the walls. Strings connecting names and places. Photos of every Sims Foundation facility. He barely slept. Barely ate. Randy stopped by once and whistled low. You look like hell. I feel like hell. Henry pointed to a map of Connecticut. There's a facility here, the Hartley Home for Children. Gertrude visits it every month. Always on the 15th. Always alone. What are you thinking? I'm thinking I need to see what she's doing there. Randy frowned. That's risky. If she sees you, she won't. The problem was that Henry couldn't just show up with cameras blazing. He needed inside information. He needed someone on the inside of the Sims operation who was willing to talk. And that meant finding someone with a conscience or someone with a grudge. He found her 2 days later. Rosario Glover, former employee of the Sims Foundation. She'd worked as an administrator at their New Jersey facility for 3 years before being fired for insubordination. Henry tracked her down to a small apartment in Newark, where she worked as a waitress. I'm not talking to you, she said when he showed up at her door. I signed an NDA. They'll sue me into oblivion. What if I told you I have evidence that could bring down the whole operation? Henry showed her a photo of Ethan's tattoo. This is my son. They did this to him, and I think they've done worse to other children. Rosario stared at the photo. Something in her face cracked. Jesus Christ. They're actually doing it. Doing what? She let him in. Over the next 3 hours, Rosario told Henry everything. The Sims Foundation wasn't just a charity, it was a pipeline. They took children from vulnerable situations, processed them through their facilities, and sold them to wealthy buyers around the world. Not for adoption, for servitude, for labor, for worse things that Rosario wouldn't name, but that Henry could guess. Gertrude Sims runs it, Rosario said. But she's not alone. There are others. Wealthy families who've been doing this for generations. It's a network. They call themselves the Providence Circle. The what? It's what they call their little club. Old money families who think they're above the law because they've literally bought their way above it. Judges, police chiefs, politicians. They own them all. Henry felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. How many children? I don't know. Hundreds? Maybe thousands over the years. Rosario's voice was hollow. I didn't want to believe it. I thought maybe it was just shady adoption practices. But then I saw the marks, the tattoos, and I realized what they were really doing. Why didn't you go to the police? Rosario laughed bitterly. With what proof? The files are encrypted. The money trails are buried. And like I said, they own people. When I tried to make noise about it, I got a visit from a very polite man who explained that if I didn't shut up, my sister would die in a car accident. He showed me photos of her car, her route to work, her schedule. So yes, I signed an NDA and I kept my mouth shut. But you're talking to me now because you have evidence. That tattoo is proof. And because... She paused. Because I'm tired of living scared. If you're really going after them, I'll help you. But you have to promise me you'll burn them all down. Not just Gertrude. All of them. Henry promised. With Rosario's help, he began to understand the scope of what he was up against. The Providence Circle had existed for over 60 years. Gertrude's father had been a founding member. It started as a way for wealthy families to secure servants and laborers without the messy complications of legal employment. Over time, it had evolved into something darker, a marketplace for children. But they were arrogant. They thought themselves untouchable, and that arrogance would be their downfall. Henry started planning, not just to expose them. That wasn't enough. He needed to destroy them so completely that they could never rebuild. He needed to make them pay in a way that was poetic, personal, devastating, and he needed to make sure that when it was over, Ethan and every other child they'd marked would be free. He called Randy. I need you to arrange something for me. Something that's probably illegal. I'm listening. I need to get inside the Hartley home, and I need to do it during one of Gertrude's visits. Can you make that happen? Randy was quiet. How illegal are we talking? Breaking and entering. Wiretapping. Maybe assault if things go wrong. Jesus, Henry. Are you in or not? Another pause. Then, I'm in. But if we're doing this, we're doing it smart. No cowboy shit. We document everything. We build a case that's bulletproof. And then we hand it to someone who can actually do something with it. Who? You said yourself they own the police. They don't own everyone. I have a contact at the FBI. Someone I trust. Someone who specializes in trafficking cases. Randy's voice was grim. But we're going to need ironclad evidence. The kind that even the best lawyers can't argue with. Henry smiled for the first time in weeks. Then let's give them ironclad evidence. The Hartley home for children sat on 12 acres of pristine Connecticut woodland, looking more like a country estate than a facility for at-risk youth. Henry watched it through binoculars from a hill a quarter-mile away, noting the security cameras, the fencing, the single road in and out. "It's a fortress," Randy muttered beside him. "How are we supposed to get in there?" "We're not." Henry lowered the binoculars. "Not during the day, anyway." They'd been surveilling the facility for 3 days, learning the patterns. Staff arrived at 7 in the morning, left at 6 at night. A skeleton crew stayed overnight, just 2 people. The children, about 20 of them, aged 5 to 15, were locked in their dormitories at 8 sharp. And Gertrude arrived at precisely 2 p.m. every 15th of the month, staying for exactly 3 hours. "She's meeting with someone," Henry said. "Someone important. Otherwise, why the regular schedule?" Rosario had given them everything she had: old employee records, partial financial documents, the names of other facilities in the network. But she didn't know the details of Gertrude's monthly visits. That was above her pay grade. "So what's the plan?" Randy asked. Henry had been thinking about this for days. "We get inside tonight. Plant cameras and microphones in the offices where Gertrude meets. Then we wait for the next visit and see what we catch. And if we get caught, then we improvise." They went in at 2 a.m., cutting through the fence in a spot where the cameras didn't quite reach. Henry had studied the security system. It was expensive but outdated, the kind wealthy people install because it looked good rather than because it was effective. They wore dark clothes and moved like shadows, crossing the lawn to a side entrance that Rosario had told them was rarely locked. It wasn't. Inside, the Hartley home was pristine. Hardwood floors, expensive furniture, paintings on the walls. It looked more like a museum than a place where children lived. But when Henry passed one of the dormitories and heard the sound of a child crying, the illusion shattered. "Second floor," Henry whispered. "Administration offices." They found Gertrude's office easily. It had her name on the door. Inside, it was exactly what Henry expected. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, and a portrait of her father on the wall. Henry planted a camera disguised as a pen holder on the desk and a microphone inside the phone. Then he went to work on her computer. "We don't have time for this," Randy hissed. "I need to see what she's hiding." Henry plugged in a USB drive and started copying files. Encrypted files. Financial records. Correspondence. Everything. A sound for downstairs made them both freeze. "Shit," Randy breathed. Footsteps. Coming up the stairs. Henry grabbed his equipment, and they slipped into a supply closet across the hall, just as someone entered Gertrude's office. Through the crack in the door, Henry could see a man, late 50s, expensive suit, looking around the room like he was searching for something. "Who the hell is that?" Randy whispered. Henry didn't know, but he took photos on his phone. The man spent 5 minutes in the office, made a phone call that Henry couldn't quite hear, then left. They waited another 20 minutes before moving. By the time they made it back to their car, the sun was starting to rise. "That was too close," Randy said, hands shaking. "If we'd been caught." But we weren't. Henry looked at the USB drive in his hand. "And now we have her files." Back at the house, Henry spent 2 days breaking the encryption. It was military grade, but he'd learned a few tricks over the years. When the files finally opened, what he found inside made him physically ill. Lists. Hundreds of names. Children's names. Dates of acquisition. Dates of transfer. Locations. And prices. Actual dollar amounts for human beings. "Oh my God," Randy whispered, reading over his shoulder. "This is evidence," Henry said grimly. "This is everything we need." But there was more. Correspondence between Gertrude and other members of the Providence Circle. Plans for expansion. Discussions about which judges they'd need to bribe for an upcoming case. And most damning of all, video files. Henry opened one and immediately wished he hadn't. It showed the processing facility Rosario had told them about, a clinical white room where children were photographed, measured, documented, and marked. He watched in horror as a tattoo artist put numbers on children's arms while they screamed. He found Ethan in the videos. His son, terrified and crying, being held down while someone shaved his head. Being marked. being processed like cattle. Henry turned off the video before he could see more. His hands were shaking. His vision blurred with rage. "We need to move on this now," Randy said. "Today. Tomorrow at the latest. We take this to the FBI and—" "No!" Henry's voice was cold. "Not yet. Henry." I said not yet. He looked at Randy. "This evidence proves what they did, but it doesn't destroy them. Not really. They'll get lawyers. They'll use their connections. Some of them might do jail time, but others will walk. And in 10 years, they'll rebuild under a different name. So what do you want to do?" Henry smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I want to give them exactly what they've given these children. I want to mark them, make them infamous, destroy their lives so completely that their own families will disown them." Over the next week, Henry executed his plan. He was methodical, patient. First, he created documentation packages, encrypted files containing everything he'd found, along with statements from Rosario and other former employees that Randy had tracked down. He sent these packages to multiple secure locations and set them to auto-release if anything happened to him or Ethan. Then he began reaching out to journalists. Not mainstream ones, they could be bought, but independent investigators. People who'd built their careers on exposing the powerful. People who would salivate over a story this big. He chose 5 journalists, all with impeccable reputations. He sent each of them a sample of the evidence, enough to prove it was real, but not enough to break the story without his full cooperation. Then he waited. The responses came within days. All 5 wanted in. They were ready to help him bring down the Providence Circle. But Henry had one more move to make before the story broke. He needed to confront Gertrude. Not because he owed her an explanation, but because he wanted her to know, he wanted all of them to know, that their downfall came from the people they considered beneath them, that their arrogance had been their undoing. He called Candace from a burner phone. She answered on the first ring. "Henry? Well, thank God. Where are you? Where's Ethan? You mean inventory number 2847? Henry's voice was ice. "He's safe. No thanks to you." Silence. Then, "Henry, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly. You and your mother run a trafficking network. You mark children and sell them. And you try to do it to our son. It's not like that. It's tradition. It's how things are done in families like ours. The children go to good homes. They're well cared for. They're slaves, Candace. You turn children into slaves. You're being dramatic. My mother explained it all to me when I was young. These children would have terrible lives otherwise. We give them opportunities." "Stop." Henry's voice cracked. "Just stop. I don't want to hear your justifications. I want you to tell Gertrude something for me." "What?" "Tell her I'm coming for her. Tell her I have everything. The files, the videos, the testimony. Tell her the Providence Circle is done. And tell her that when I'm finished, the name Sims will be synonymous with child trafficking for the next 100 years. He hung up before she could respond. Within an hour, his phone rang. Unknown number. He let it go to voicemail. The message was from Gertrude, and her voice was calm. Too calm. "Henry, dear, let's not be hasty. I think we should meet and discuss this like adults. You're understandably upset, but there are things you don't understand. Financial considerations. Legal protections. If you move forward with whatever you're planning, you'll find yourself in a great deal of trouble. But if you're reasonable, I'm prepared to offer you compensation for your distress. Shall we say $5 million? Enough to start over somewhere nice. Somewhere far away. With Ethan, of course. Just the 2 of you." Henry deleted the message. They thought he could be bought. They still didn't understand. He didn't want their money. He wanted their destruction. The next day, all 5 journalists published simultaneously. The story went viral within hours. Wealthy families run child trafficking network for decades. The evidence was irrefutable. Photos, videos, financial records, testimony from dozens of former employees. And at the center of it all, Gertrude Sims and the Providence Circle. Within 24 hours, FBI agents raided every Sims Foundation facility. They found the processing room. They found the children, including 53 who'd been marked for transfer that month. They found evidence linking the operation to 12 wealthy families across the Northeast. Henry watched it all unfold on the news from his safe house. Ethan sat beside him, not quite understanding what was happening, but sensing it was important. "Are we safe now, Daddy?" he asked. "Yes, champ. We're safe now." But Henry knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The arrests happened quickly. FBI agents, flanked by state police, descended on the homes of Providence Circle members like an invading army. Gertrude Sims was arrested at her estate while trying to burn documents in her fireplace. Candace was picked up at a friend's house, hysterical and demanding a lawyer. In total, 17 people were charged with trafficking, conspiracy, and dozens of related crimes. The evidence Henry had gathered made prosecution almost too easy. But Henry wanted more than prison. Prison was temporary. Prison allowed for appeals, for early release, for some chance at redemption. Henry wanted permanent destruction. So he planned for that too. While the journalists broke the trafficking story, Henry had been working on a second phase. With Rosario's help, he'd identified every child who'd ever passed through the Providence Circle's network. Over 300 children across 20 years. Randy's contacts helped track them down, now adults scattered across the country and world. Henry created a registry, a public database documenting every child the Providence Circle had trafficked, where they'd been sent, what had happened to them. Some had been recovered and placed in legitimate homes. Others had simply vanished. The registry was a monument to the Circle's crimes, and it was permanent, searchable, and growing as more victims came forward. He also established a foundation, funded by C's Providence Circle assets, to provide therapy, legal support, and financial assistance to survivors. It was called the Ethan Foundation, named for his son who'd been brave enough to survive. But Henry's most devastating blow came from something simpler: social destruction. He'd compiled dossiers on every Providence Circle family, not just their crimes, but every dirty secret, every affair, every business dealing that skirted legality. He leaked these selectively to their communities, their churches, their country clubs. Within weeks, these families were pariahs. Their businesses collapsed. Their social circles evaporated. Even family members who hadn't been directly involved in trafficking found themselves tainted by association. The Sims real estate empire crumbled when every client pulled out simultaneously. The Sims name became poison in business circles. Gertrude's beloved country club expelled her family. Her church asked them not to return. Henry made sure that when you Googled Sims, the first 100 results were about child trafficking. Forever. 3 months after the arrests, Henry was called to testify before a grand jury. He walked them through everything: the disappearance, the discovery, the investigation. He showed them Ethan's tattoo. He made them understand the scope of what had been done. The grand jury indicted everyone Henry had named. The trials were scheduled to begin in 6 months. But Gertrude didn't make it a trial. 2 weeks before jury selection was scheduled to begin, she was found dead in her jail cell. Officially, it was suicide. She'd hanged herself with torn bedsheets. But Henry suspected one of her former associates had arranged it. The Providence Circle was eating itself, eliminating witnesses who might cooperate with prosecutors. He felt nothing when he heard the news. Not satisfaction, not relief, just a hollow sort of acknowledgement that one chapter had closed. Candace's trial was the hardest to watch. She sat in the defendant's chair, looking small and confused, as if she genuinely couldn't understand why everyone was so upset. Her lawyer tried to argue she'd been brainwashed, that she was a victim of generational abuse and indoctrination. The jury didn't buy it. She was convicted on 12 counts of conspiracy to commit trafficking and sentenced to 25 years. Henry didn't attend the sentencing. He'd already said everything he needed to say in his victim impact statement, which the judge read aloud. "My wife didn't just betray me. She betrayed our son. She allowed her mother to mark him like property, to traumatize him in ways he may never fully recover from, all in service of maintaining a family legacy built on the suffering of children. She chose wealth and status over her own child's well-being. She chose silence over justice. And when confronted with the truth, her only concern was protecting herself. I will never forgive her. My son will grow up without a mother, but that's better than growing up with one who saw him as inventory." The courtroom had been silent when the judge finished reading. In the months that followed, Henry focused on rebuilding Ethan's life. The nightmares were less frequent. The wariness in his eyes was fading. Dr. Davenport said he was making remarkable progress, all things considered. They stayed in their small rented house. Henry sold his documentary production company. He didn't need it anymore, and the story he'd told about the Providence Circle had won multiple journalism awards. The prize money and book deals that followed gave him more than enough to provide for Ethan. More importantly, it gave him time. Time to be present. Time to help his son heal. On Ethan's 7th birthday, Henry took him to the park. They flew kites and ate ice cream, and Ethan laughed, really laughed, for the first time since that terrible night. "Daddy," Ethan said as they walked back to the car, "are the bad people all gone now?" Henry thought about Gertrude dead in her cell, about Candace in prison, about the 17 other Providence Circle members serving sentences ranging from 15 years to life, about the families destroyed, the reputations ruined, the empire dismantled. "Yes," he said, "the bad people are gone." Ethan nodded, satisfied. Then he reached up and pushed back his hair. It had grown back thick and dark, revealing the faint scar behind his ear where they'd cut him. "Can we get my tattoo removed?" "Absolutely." Dr. Watkins said, "We can start the laser treatments next month. It'll take a few sessions, but we'll get rid of it." "Good. I don't want their numbers on me anymore." Henry hugged his son tight. "You were never just a number. You're Ethan Richardson, and you're the bravest person I know." As they drove home, Henry's phone buzzed. A text from Randy. Final conviction came through. "Last Providence Circle member sentenced today. 35 years. It's over." Henry smiled and deleted the text. It wasn't over, not really. There would be appeals. There would be civil suits. There would be years of legal aftermath. But the important part, the part that mattered, was done. The children were free. The monsters were caged, and his son was safe. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Ethan was playing with his dinosaur, humming that same cartoon tune he'd been humming the morning everything changed. Some things, Henry realized, don't change even when everything else does. And that was enough. A year later, Henry stood in front of an auditorium filled with child welfare advocates, law enforcement officials, and survivors. He'd been invited to speak about his experience and the systemic changes needed to prevent trafficking operations like the Providence Circle from existing. He spoke for an hour about recognizing warning signs, about the importance of questioning powerful institutions, about how evil often wears a respectable face. He talked about the registry he'd created and the foundation that now helped hundreds of survivors. But mostly, he talked about Ethan, about how one child's suffering had uncovered the suffering of hundreds, about how his son's resilience had inspired movement. When he finished, the room gave him a standing ovation. But Henry barely noticed. His eyes were on the back of the room, where Ethan sat with Dr. Davenport coloring in a workbook. His son looked up, caught his eye, and waved. Henry waved back. After the speech, Randy found him in the hallway. "That was incredible. You know there's talk of legislation now. The Richardson Act, they're calling it. New federal guidelines for monitoring private child welfare organizations." "Good," Henry said. "Good? Henry, you changed the system. You exposed a network that had operated with impunity for decades. You saved lives." Randy paused. "How does it feel?" Henry thought about it. How'd it feel? He destroyed his marriage. He'd lost his career. He'd spent a year of his life consumed by rage and the need for justice. He'd seen things in those Providence Circle videos that would haunt him forever. But he'd also saved his son and hundreds of other children. He'd made sure that when future generations learned about the Providence Circle, they'd see it as a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of wealth without accountability, power without conscience. "It feels," Henry said slowly, "like the beginning." The beginning of what? Of making sure this never happens again. He found Ethan and they walked out of the auditorium together. The tattoo on his son's arm was almost completely gone, just a faint shadow that would disappear entirely after one more treatment. The scar behind his ear had faded to a thin line. The psychological scars would take longer to heal. Maybe they'd never fully disappear. But Ethan was strong. He was seeing Dr. Davenport twice a week. He was making friends at his new school. He was laughing again. and he was safe. That night, after putting Ethan to bed, Henry sat in his office and pulled up an encrypted file on his computer. It was his complete investigation. Every document, every video, every piece of evidence he'd gathered. He'd given copies to law enforcement and journalists, but he'd kept this master file for himself. He looked at it for a long moment, then created a new folder. For Ethan, he titled it, "When He's Ready." Someday, his son would want to know the full story. Someday, he'd want to understand exactly what had happened and how his father had fought back. And when that day came, Henry would show him this file. He'd show him how one person, armed with truth and determination, could bring down an empire of evil. But for now, Ethan was 7 years old. For now, he deserved to be a child, to play with dinosaurs and fly kites, and eat ice cream in the park. For now, that was enough. Henry closed his laptop and checked on his son one more time. Ethan was sleeping peacefully, his stuffed dinosaur clutched in his arms, no nightmares disturbing his rest. Henry stood in the doorway and made a silent promise. Whatever came next, whatever challenges they faced, he would always protect his son. He would always fight for him. He would always choose Ethan over everything else. Because that's what fathers do. And unlike the monsters he'd exposed, unlike Gertrude and Candace and all the other members of the Providence Circle, Henry Richardson understood that children weren't property. They weren't inventory. They were precious, irreplaceable, deserving of protection and love. They were everything. He turned off the light and closed the door, leaving his son to dreams that were finally, blessedly, free of darkness. In the morning, they would go to the park again. They would fly kites and eat ice cream and be a family of two. And that would be enough. That would always be enough. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.